It was an ordinary day for Tyrell, a 16-year-old boy, as he walked home from school. He had just finished a long day of classes and was looking forward to relaxing at home. He was a respectful young man, a good student, and always did what was right. Tyrell lived in a neighborhood where things were tough, but he never let it define him. He kept his head down, focused on his studies, and avoided trouble. As he walked down the street, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything. Tyrell was just a few blocks away from his home when he saw a police car pull up behind him. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was a routine stop, right? He wasn't doing anything wrong. But as the police officer got out of the car, things took an unexpected turn. The officer's face was serious, and his demeanor was more aggressive than Tyrell had ever expected. The officer quickly approached him, cutting off any chance of calm conversation. "What's your name?" the officer demanded sharply. Tyrell stood still for a moment, surprised by the question. He wasn't used to being treated this way, especially when he was just walking home. "Tyrell," he said, trying to stay calm. "I'm just walking home from school." The officer didn't seem to care. Without explanation, he immediately grabbed Tyrell's arm, pulling him toward the police car. "You're under arrest, kid." "What? Why?" Tyrell's heart started to race as the officer's grip tightened. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officer wasn't listening. He pulled Tyrell into the back of the car without any explanation or concern for what Tyrell was saying. Tyrell could hardly believe what was happening. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being treated like a criminal. He had never been arrested before, and the fear of the unknown set in. Why was this happening to him? Then, just as the officer was about to drive away, Tyrell's mother, Gina, arrived on the scene. Her face was calm but determined. She had no idea what was going on, but she wasn't about to let her son be treated this way. "What's going on here?" Gina asked, stepping forward and looking at the officer. "Why is my son in the back of your car?" The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by her sudden arrival. But when Gina revealed who she was, everything changed. What happens next? How will the officer react when he learns who Gina really is? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. Tyrell had always been a good kid. Growing up in a neighborhood that wasn't always the safest, he knew that he had to work harder than most to stay out of trouble. He was a straight-A student who focused on his schoolwork, kept to himself, and avoided the drama that came with living in a high-crime area. His mom, Gina, was his role model. She taught him to always respect others, no matter their background, and to always stand up for what was right. Gina was a woman who worked tirelessly to provide for their family. She had risen through the ranks in her career and had become a successful district attorney. Her hard work and determination had earned her the respect of her colleagues, but more importantly, she taught Tyrell that honesty and integrity were the most important qualities a person could have. Tyrell often thought about how different his life could be if he lived in a different neighborhood. If he lived somewhere where people weren't so quick to judge based on how you looked, maybe things would be different. But Tyrell didn't let his environment define him. He had big dreams. He wanted to go to college, make his mother proud, and become someone who could make a difference. That afternoon, after school, Tyrell was walking home when he was stopped by the police. It wasn't the first time he'd been stopped by officers in the neighborhood, but it was the first time he had been treated this way. The police were always around in the area, sometimes just checking on people, sometimes pulling over cars. Tyrell had gotten used to it, but today was different. As he walked down the street, he saw the flashing lights of a police car. He didn't think much of it. He figured it was just another routine stop. He had done nothing wrong, so he wasn't worried. But as the officer approached, Tyrell could feel the tension in the air. The officer didn't greet him politely as most officers did during a stop. Instead, he immediately began accusing Tyrell of something he hadn't done. The officer wasn't interested in hearing Tyrell's side. He just started grabbing at him and pulling him toward the police car. Tyrell was confused and scared. He didn't understand why he was being treated like this. He had done nothing wrong. He'd always followed the rules, and yet he was being arrested. Why was the officer accusing him? Why was he making this so difficult? As the officer pulled him into the back of the car, Tyrell realized that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just a simple stop. This was about more than just a misunderstanding. This felt personal. That's when Tyrell's mom, Gina, arrived. She'd been working late at her office, but as soon as she saw the flashing lights, she knew something wasn't right. She had always taught Tyrell to stay calm in situations like this. But Gina knew that the situation had escalated far beyond what it should have been. When she saw her son being pulled into the car, her heart dropped. "What's going on here?" Gina asked, her voice strong, demanding an explanation. The officer was caught off guard by her arrival, but when Gina revealed who she was, the situation changed entirely. Tyrell's mom, Gina, was no ordinary woman. She was the district attorney of their city. With years of experience in law, she had spent her career making sure justice was served and holding people accountable for their actions. She had worked hard to build her reputation and to ensure that the law was always followed fairly. And now, her knowledge of the law and her role as district attorney would become the key to unlocking what was happening to her son. As Gina approached the police car, her heart raced. She had no idea what was going on, but seeing Tyrell in the back of the car, his face filled with confusion and fear, was enough to send her into action. The officer, still standing by the car, looked a little nervous now that Gina was there. He hadn't expected her to show up, and he definitely hadn't expected who she was. "What's going on here?" Gina asked firmly, her voice calm but strong. She stepped closer, looking at the officer with steady eyes. Her presence was commanding, and it was clear that she wasn't just any mother. She was someone who knew her rights and understood the law. The officer hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Ma'am, your son was just caught near a robbery scene, and we have reason to believe he's involved. I'm taking him in for questioning." His tone was dismissive, almost as if the situation was a mere inconvenience. Carla's breath caught in her throat. This was absurd. Tyrell was innocent, and she knew it. Why were they treating him this way? He was a teenager, with no record, no involvement in anything illegal, and here he was, being accused of something he hadn't done. "What?" Gina responded, her eyes narrowing with disbelief. "My son wasn't anywhere near a robbery. He was walking home from school." The officer looked at her, then back at Tyrell, clearly unsure what to do now that Gina was involved. He had probably assumed that no one would challenge him, especially not a teenager from this neighborhood. But Gina wasn't just going to stand by and let her son be treated like this. Tyrell, who had been silent up until now, looked up at his mom with a mix of fear and relief. She was here. He didn't know how to get out of this situation, but knowing that his mom, the district attorney, was with him gave him the courage to speak up. "Mom, I didn't do anything. I swear." Gina put her hand on Tyrell's shoulder, her touch steadying him. She knew her son was telling the truth. He wasn't involved in any crime. She wasn't about to let an officer accuse him based on nothing more than suspicion. "I need you to release my son right now." Gina's voice was no longer just calm. It had an edge to it now. the kind of voice that people in positions of power use when they want to make it clear that they are not to be messed with. The officer was still holding Tyrell's arm, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I can't just let him go without questioning. We need to investigate." "You're not investigating anything," Gina said sharply. "I'm the district attorney of this city. You have no reason to arrest him. He was not involved in the robbery." The officer stood frozen for a moment, processing the information. He had clearly underestimated Gina. He didn't expect her to be a district attorney, let alone one who was not afraid to stand up for what was right. Carla could see the officer's posture change. He took a step back, lowering his hand from Tyrell's arm. Gina's identity had shifted the power dynamic in an instant. The officer went from aggressive to unsure, and the situation was suddenly in her control. "What do you think you're doing?" Gina demanded, staring directly at the officer. "You don't get to treat my son like this." The officer's face reddened. He was starting to panic. He had no idea who he was dealing with. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but—" Gina cut him off. "You have no right to arrest my son. I demand that you let him go right now." The officer stumbled over his words, now realizing just how big of a mistake he had made. Gina's position as district attorney meant that she had the authority to make sure that this incident didn't just go away. The officer had abused his power, and Gina wasn't going to let him off easy. "You're going to report this incident immediately," Gina added, her voice colder now, "and you're going to be held accountable for your actions." The officer nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize," but it was too late for apologies now. Gina wasn't interested in his excuses. She had seen enough injustice in her career to know when something wasn't right, and this situation was a clear example of racial profiling and abuse of power. Tyrell, still in shock, but feeling a sense of relief, slowly stepped out of the police car. He looked at his mom, still processing what had just happened. It felt like a dream. How could this officer have treated him like this? Gina gently placed her arm around his shoulders, leading him away from the police car. "Don't worry, baby. This is over now. You're safe," she whispered softly. She didn't want him to worry any more than he already had. As they walked away from the officer, Gina's eyes never left him. She wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. She was going to make sure that the officer faced consequences for his actions. He had to understand that there were serious repercussions for racial profiling and for treating people based on stereotypes instead of facts. The officer stood there, realizing that he had made a huge mistake. His job wasn't just to enforce the law, it was to protect and serve everyone, no matter their background or appearance, and today he had failed at both. After Tyrell was safely out of the car, Gina turned back to face the officer. Her eyes were still firm, and her voice was steady, but the officer could see the anger behind her calm demeanor. This wasn't just about getting her son out of a tough situation, it was about justice and ensuring that no one else would be wrongly treated the way Tyrell had been. "You need to understand something, officer," Gina began, her tone serious. "What you did today isn't just wrong, it's illegal." The officer swallowed hard, clearly realizing the weight of her words. He had thought that by simply arresting Tyrell, he could get away with it. But now he understood that he had crossed a line. This wasn't just any random citizen. This was the mother of a district attorney, a woman who knew the law inside and out, and she wasn't going to let him get away with his mistake. "I've worked my entire career fighting for justice," Gina continued, her voice growing in strength. "And I've worked hard to make sure people are treated fairly. But what you did today, what you did to my son, was nothing short of an abuse of power." The officer didn't know what to say. He stood there, silent, looking at the ground, unable to make eye contact with Gina. She had caught him in a lie, and he knew he couldn't escape it. You can't treat people like this because you're afraid of what they might look like, or because you assume they're guilty. Gina's voice softened a little, but her words still packed a punch. If we want a safer world, we have to start by treating each other with respect and dignity, not jumping to conclusions based on appearances. Tyrell, who had been standing silently by his mother, watched as Gina's words struck the officer. He had never seen his mom so serious, but he knew this was important. She wasn't just protecting him. She was standing up for what was right. She was teaching him what it meant to have integrity, even when things weren't fair. The officer finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. He took a deep breath and seemed to gather himself before speaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he stammered. "I made a mistake. I was just doing my job." "Your job," Gina interrupted, "is to protect and serve, not to profile and accuse." The officer didn't respond. He simply nodded, a silent admission that he had learned a hard lesson today. His actions had been reckless, and they could have had serious consequences if Gina hadn't stepped in. "I'm sorry," the officer said, his voice now much quieter. "I should have handled this differently." Gina didn't feel the need to say anything else. The apology was nice, but it didn't erase what had happened. The truth was that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was part of a bigger problem. People of color were frequently targeted, and incidents like this happened far too often. "It's not just about saying sorry, officer," Gina said. "It's about learning from this, acknowledging that this is a problem, and working to make sure it doesn't happen again." The officer nodded again, understanding that his apology wasn't enough. He needed to do more than just apologize. He needed to actively change the way he did his job. It wasn't just about his actions today. It was about recognizing that racial bias and discrimination had no place in law enforcement. Gina wasn't going to let the situation slip by. She was determined to make sure this incident was reported and investigated properly. She wasn't going to rest until she knew that this officer was held accountable for his actions. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," Gina said firmly, turning to Tyrell. "You don't need to worry anymore, Tyrell. I've got this." Tyrell, still processing everything, nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. His mom had handled everything with grace and power. She had protected him, and now she was going to make sure this officer faced the consequences for his actions. The officer stood there, knowing that he had lost more than just this incident. He had lost his credibility. His actions had been exposed, and now he had to face the reality of what he had done. As Gina and Tyrell walked away from the scene, Gina's mind was already focused on the next steps. This wasn't over. She had a responsibility to ensure that the department took this matter seriously, and that real change was made. She wasn't going to let this slip under the rug. But for now, Tyrell was safe, and that was all that mattered to Gina. The days following the incident were filled with a whirlwind of emotions for Tyrell and his mother, Gina. What had started as a routine walk home from school had turned into a pivotal moment, not just for them, but for the entire community. Gina's decision to stand up for her son and demand accountability for the officer's actions had caught the attention of people everywhere. It wasn't just a mother defending her child. It was a call to action for justice, fairness, and equality. For Tyrell, the experience had shaken him to his core. He had always prided himself on doing the right thing, on being a good student, a respectful son, and a responsible young man. Yet, here he was, wrongfully accused of something he hadn't done, simply because of the way he looked. That thought weighed heavily on him. How many other people had been treated the same way? How many had faced the same kind of discrimination without anyone speaking up for them? Gina could see the effect the incident had on Tyrell. She knew her son was a kind-hearted and thoughtful young man, but this experience had shaken his trust in the world. She pulled him aside one evening after dinner, looking at him with a mix of love and concern. She knew that this was a teaching moment, not just for him, but for their entire community. It was about helping Tyrell understand not only what had happened to him, but why it was important to make sure it didn't happen again. Tyrell, what happened today isn't just about you, Gina said softly, sitting beside him. This is about everyone who faces unfair treatment. This is about people being judged based on the color of their skin, or where they come from, or even how they look. But this doesn't define you. Tyrell looked at his mother, his eyes still clouded with confusion. He wanted to believe that things would go back to normal, but he couldn't help feeling the sting of what had happened. It's not fair, Mom. Why did he treat me like that? I didn't do anything wrong. Gina nodded, understanding his frustration. I know, sweetheart. It's hard to understand sometimes. But this is where we have to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. We don't let anyone define us or treat us badly because of who we are. That's why we have to speak out, so things can change. It's not just about your situation. It's about all the people who have been through the same thing. Tyrell felt the weight of her words. It wasn't just about him. It was about a system that still had so much injustice, where people like him were wrongly accused and unfairly treated just because of their race. Over the next few days, Carla began to use her platform as district attorney to speak about the incident. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away without making sure it had an impact. The public response was strong, with many people voicing their support for Tyrell. Community members came forward, sharing their own experiences of police misconduct and racial profiling. Gina knew that this wasn't a fight she could fight alone. She was the district attorney, yes, but this was a community issue. It was an issue that affected everyone, not just people who worked in law enforcement or had the power to make laws. The issue of bias and discrimination was far-reaching, affecting the lives of thousands, maybe millions of people across the country. Gina wasn't just thinking about the immediate aftermath. She was already planning for the long-term changes that were needed. She knew that the system wasn't perfect and that it was full of flaws, but she also knew that her position gave her the opportunity to push for reform, to make sure that no one else would have to go through the same unfair treatment that Tyrell had faced. She immediately called for a meeting with the police chief and other city officials. She had one goal in mind: to make sure that this incident was fully investigated and that the police officer involved was held accountable for his actions. But Gina also knew that this wasn't just about holding the officer accountable. It was about changing the system. This isn't just about this officer, Gina said during the meeting, her voice strong and resolute. This is about ensuring that our police force treats everyone fairly and with respect. It's about making sure that no one is targeted based on the way they look or where they come from. It's about making sure that people of color are treated with the dignity they deserve. There was silence in the room as Gina's words hung in the air. The room was full of people who had the power to make change, but she knew it was up to her to push them, to demand action. I don't want this to be another case of people turning a blind eye, Gina continued, her gaze unwavering. I want to see real change. I want to see training on racial bias. I want to see a community policing program that bridges the gap between officers and the people they serve. We can't keep doing things the way we've always done them. We need a better future for everyone. The police chief, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "We hear you, Gina. We'll take this seriously. We'll begin implementing new training and review the policies that led to this incident. We'll do better." For Gina, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She had started the conversation, and now it was time for everyone to get involved. She used her influence to organize town hall meetings where people could voice their concerns and suggest ways to improve their community. People began to speak up, sharing their own stories, some of which were heartbreaking, others filled with anger. The momentum was building. The community was waking up to the reality of racial injustice, and they were ready to take action. Tyrell, once confused and shaken, was now a part of something much bigger than himself. He began attending community meetings with his mom, learning how important it was to stand up for what's right, and how his voice could make a difference. The experience had been painful, but it had also opened his eyes to the fact that he wasn't alone in facing discrimination. "Mom, I think I can help too," Tyrell said one evening, his voice full of determination. "I want to talk about this too. I want to help make sure this doesn't happen again." Gina smiled, proud of her son's growth. She knew that Tyrell would be an important voice in the movement for change. She had always taught him to stand up for himself. But now, Tyrell was learning that standing up for others was just as important. As the days turned into weeks, the community continued to speak out, with Tyrell and Gina at the forefront of this movement. The officer involved in the incident faced disciplinary action, and the police department began taking steps to reform their practices. Tyrell's story became a powerful reminder of why these changes were necessary, and it inspired other communities across the country to take action, too. For Gina, this fight was far from over. She knew that one incident wasn't going to change everything, but it was a start. It was a start toward a future where justice and equality would be the norm for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. It was a start toward creating a community where everyone felt safe, valued, and respected. In the end, Gina's fight for her son wasn't just about one mother protecting her child. It was about changing the world for everyone. It was about teaching her son the importance of standing up for justice, and about showing the world that one voice can spark real change. As the weeks passed and the dust settled from the incident, Gina's work was far from over. What had started as a personal battle to protect her son had transformed into a powerful movement for justice, equality, and reform. But this wasn't just about Gina or Tyrell. It was about everyone who had been wrongly treated, every person who had faced discrimination, and every voice that had remained silent. Now was the time to stand up, speak out, and make sure change happened for everyone. "The fight doesn't end here," Gina said during one of the town hall meetings she helped organize. "We've made progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done." She was right. The momentum they had built was undeniable, but it would take continued effort from everyone to make sure that the police were held accountable and that racial bias no longer shaped the way communities were policed. Gina wasn't the only one who could bring change. Everyone in the community had to play their part. "If this story has taught us anything, it's that we can't stay silent in the face of injustice," Gina continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We all have a responsibility to speak out when we see something wrong, to stand up for those who can't, and to fight for a fairer future for all." And Gina wasn't just talking to the people in the room. She was speaking to everyone watching, everyone listening. The story of Tyrell wasn't just one moment. It was part of a much larger picture, a picture of change that everyone could be part of. So what can you do? How can you help move this fight forward? How can you ensure that this story doesn't fade into the background, but instead becomes part of a broader conversation about racial justice and police reform? Speak up. The first step is always speaking up when you see injustice. If you witness unfair treatment, if you see something that doesn't seem right, don't stay silent. Your voice matters. Every voice matters. Get involved. It doesn't matter if you're not a district attorney or an activist. You can still make a difference. Attend community meetings. Join local movements that are fighting for justice and equality. Support organizations that work to eliminate racial bias in law enforcement. Your time, your support, your voice can help bring about the changes needed to create a better world for everyone. Vote. Change doesn't only happen in the streets, it also happens in the voting booth. Make sure you're voting for leaders who will fight for justice, who will work to reform police practices, and who will make our communities safer for everyone. You have the power to make sure your voice is heard in the policies that shape our world. Gina and Tyrell's story is just one example of how powerful a single action can be. A single voice raised in the face of injustice can spark an entire movement. But it takes more than just one person. It takes a community. And it takes everyone who believes that we all deserve to be treated equally, no matter our skin color or background. Now, it's your turn. What will you do? Will you stand up for what's right? Will you speak out against injustice? Will you help make sure the next generation grows up in a world where everyone is treated with fairness and respect? This is your opportunity to make a difference. Don't wait for someone else to take the lead. Be the change you want to see. We want to hear your thoughts. What can we do to make sure that Tyrell's story is not just a moment in time, but a turning point in the fight for racial justice? What steps will you take to stand up for equality? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because the conversation doesn't stop here. This is just the beginning, and we need to keep talking, keep learning, and keep working together to make sure change happens. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe to continue supporting these important conversations. When you share this story, you're helping spread the message that we are all responsible for making the world a better place. Together, we can be part of the solution. Together, we can create a fairer, more just world.